morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Let's get started with our workshop, Connecting Planning and Ecology. We're going to close our polls now, and we're going to begin our program.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm Jan Ivey. I'm the chair of the Latornell Steering Committee, and on behalf of the committee, Conservation Ontario and the University of Guelph, I'd like to welcome you to the Latornell Leadership Project. We're gathered today in this virtual space from many areas of the province. As I'm speaking to you from Guelph, I'll begin by acknowledging that Guelph is situated on treaty land that is steeped in rich Indigenous history and is home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Today, I acknowledge the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation of the Anishinaabe peoples, from whose traditional territory I'm speaking to you. I'd also like to acknowledge that you're joining us today from many places near and far, and acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. 2020 has been a year of change in so many ways. Reflecting that, the Latornell Steering Committee is engaged in a review and reimagining of our annual symposium event to make sure that it continues to meet the needs of our community of practice. And while that work continues, the Latornell Leadership Project will explore ways of bringing us together through a series of webinars. These sessions will look at best practices on top of mind subjects, including today's look at conservation through a land use planning lens. We'll also look at how to communicate during a pandemic and how to ensure inclusion and diversity in planning for green spaces. We really aim to bring you first-person stories and tactical advice from Latornell's network of past, current, and upcoming conservation leaders. We're really proud of the ways the Latornell Conservation Symposium has brought us together over the past 26 years and are looking forward to reconvening in 2021. We really hope that's possible. But in the interim, we want to continue to bring Ontario conservationists together to talk about the big issues and to develop the collaborations that we need in order to find solutions. So if you haven't already, please keep in touch with us by signing up for our newsletter at latornell.ca. And thank you for joining us today with the Latornell Leadership Project. Now I'd like to introduce the moderator of today's session. You've already seen his face. That's Scott Peck. Scott is the Deputy Chief Administrative Officer and Director of Watershed Planning and Engineering at the Hamilton Conservation Authority. And he's been with HCA for 20 years, starting as a conservation planner. Scott also has 10 years of experience working for Norfolk County as a development planner and then senior planner. And over the course of his career, he's held progressive roles, working as a frontline planner right up to managing multidisciplinary environmental teams. He has a Bachelor of Arts and Diploma in Public Administration and is a registered professional planner and member of the Canadian Institute of Planners and the Ontario Professional Planners Institute. Scott is also the past chair and a current member of the Latornell Steering Committee. Scott?
Thanks, Jane, for those opening remarks. Appreciate it. Good morning, everyone. We have an awesome turnout today of over 400 people for this webinar. The workshop will begin with an overview of the role of ecology in planning, key planning instruments, including official plans, zoning bylaws, consent, subdivisions, minor variance, and site plan control. The presentation will use examples and will focus on how ecological study findings and their recommendations can most effectively make their way into planning approvals. The format today is a workshop. We really are excited about the opportunity here for some exchange of ideas. There will be one presenter with the focus on planning and ecology. We will highlight different aspects relating to the variety of planning instruments I've spoken about and how ecological studies can be incorporated into planning documents for successful conservation of our natural heritage features. There will be time after each section for general questions from the floor, also known as the Q&A box, as contributed by our participants. So if you have a question, the key's at the bottom of your screen. Please post it in and we'll get to you as soon as we can. A few housekeeping notes. First of all of our attendees are muted and you will not be able to speak or come on the video. As I say, you will find the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. If you'd like to ask any questions, please type it in the box and press enter to have it post. You can have you can upvote a question if you like by pressing the thumbs up button. Please note that Eric Gilbert and Sarah Hodgkiss of our committee will be monitoring these questions and time permitting, and as noted, we will have time to pose a few of them to our presenter. Feel free to interact with others in the webinar through the chat box. This workshop is being recorded so that members or others who are not able to attend will be able to listen at their leisure. Before I introduce our presenter, let's look at the results of our polls just for interest's sake, and Mario will pull those up for us. So we have quite a good representation over a breadth of interest from municipal consultant and conservation planners and ecologists. We have some federal and provincial people here, as well as some students. And there's some answers about why you attended. To learn something new, so that's awesome. 90%. Most of us are from the GTA and Southwestern Ontario, with smaller numbers from Eastern Ontario and Northern Ontario. And there's lots of people here that have been to Latornell in the past multiple times. And the last question about the PJs, nicely done. I'm wearing a tie today, so I'm glad that that basically 40% or 46% are not wearing their pajamas. So that's awesome. With that, Mario, I think we'll just move on to our presenter, and just like to introduce you to our presenter, Michael Winia. Michael has been involved with natural heritage since beginning his career with the Ministry of Natural Resources as a Conservation Authority Liaison Officer. He has since spent 20 years in the private sector and 13 years in the public sector dealing with a range of environmental planning and ecology projects. Michael also developed and taught the Fleming College Applied Environmental Planning Graduate Certificate Program, as well as presenting on ecology and environmental planning on a regular basis. His consulting firm, Christawan Consulting, assisted Ontario Nature in the development of their best practices manual for natural heritage systems planning and the Audubon Sanctuaries Program Golf Course Naturalization Manual. The consulting firm also is assisted with the Canadian Wildlife Service in a review of and utilization of their How Much Habitat is Enough guidelines. In his work as a senior planner and ecologist with Skelton, Brumwell and Associates Inc., Michael has completed a wide range of natural heritage projects, including a large-scale shoreline biodiversity study, municipal natural heritage studies, numerous environmental assessments and impact studies, and the preparation of official plans, comprehensive zoning bylaws, and community planning permit bylaws emphasizing natural heritage protection. So with that, welcome, Michael, and over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. Glad you could join us today for this session. And I understand that the majority of you are hoping to learn something new through the day, so I hope we can achieve that objective. I'm going to share my screen now to begin the presentation. And welcome to Connecting Planning and Ecology. Sorry. I'm going to speak to you about a topic that I'm really quite passionate about, and that is making ecology connect to planning in a meaningful way. I've been very lucky to have a career over 30 years now, both in ecology and planning, and to travel and to see nature and our impacts on it in many places. And what I've found is that good ecology is essential to protecting natural heritage, but good ecology also requires an understanding of planning to be most effective. Effective natural heritage planning relies on accurate ecological information and then recommendations that meaningfully translate to planning decisions. Natural heritage planning takes place broadly at two levels in land use planning. One is background studies that support planning documents such as official plans, secondary plans, watershed plans, and so on. Those background studies can basically be characterized as proactive. And then the second place that land use, that ecology takes place at a land use level is in environmental impact studies and natural heritage assessments. Those are prepared at the time of development proposals or for the purposes of environmental assessments. And I tend to characterize these as more reactive rather than proactive in terms of dealing with the impacts of potential development or land use change. However, in order that these studies provide recommendations effectively, they must be linked to land use planning. The best ecological information is really not of value if it can't be translated into practical and achievable recommendations that shape important planning decisions and approvals. To make sure that your findings and recommendations are implemented well, the findings, conclusions, and recommendations of an ecological report must relate directly to planning instruments involved in the decision-making process, have the capacity to be legally enforceable requirement relative to the application you're dealing with, respond to the nature of the application and the opportunity it presents, and be practical and achievable. And I'd like to just take a minute to look at each of these aspects separately. So when we talk about relating directly to the planning instrument involved in the decision-making process, here it's essential that you know what planning decision will be made based on your advice. So for example, are you dealing with an official plan amendment or are you dealing with a site plan approval? The opportunities for implementation of your ecological recommendations will differ dramatically, and your recommendations should take this into account. An official plan is an entirely different instrument and allows you to do certain things, and a site plan is another instrument that allows you to do certain things, and you really need to know which one you're dealing with in terms of making your recommendations, and to make those most effectively translate over to planning terms. Another fundamental aspect is having the capacity to be legally enforceable requirement relative to the application being dealt with. If your recommendations aren't grounded in legal requirements, they can be rejected by the approval authority or the decision can be challenged. For example, you can't apply conditions to an OPA, but you can set policy within an OPA, for example, to require certain studies. So again, you have to make sure that your recommendations are legally enforceable, grounded in the instruments you're dealing with, and relate directly to that instrument. So another example there is I've seen environmental impact studies come in relative to consents, for example. And one of the recommendations that I've seen is, well, we're concerned that invasive species would be introduced to the environment as a result of the creation of a lot for residential purposes. And there's no real effective way to deal with that. So again, the issue there doesn't relate to the planning tools, and there's no effective legal instrument to deal with that issue other than to question whether or not the consent should happen in the first place, if that is the fundamental issue. One of the other principles there is to respond to the nature of the application and the opportunities it presents, what we were just talking about. So for example, the opportunities in making recommendations on a quarry application are very different than a subdivision application. A subdivision is a permanent land use change. While you may do follow-up monitoring to assist in a future decision and perhaps limited mitigation depending on how the subdivision agreement is structured, it's a permanent land use change that's occurring. You can't turn back the clock. On the other hand, an opportunity arises when you're looking at quarries. Quarries are a temporary land use. They can make permanent changes to the landscape, obviously. However, if you utilize adaptive management plan, this allows for you to make potentially significant changes to the proposal and to propose mitigation as it unfolds. So unlike a plan of subdivision, where once it's registered and you're going through the process of development, it's really difficult to make changes to that. On the other hand, in a quarry, you can make changes as things progress. So again, your recommendations should really take into account the nature of the application and the opportunities that that particular application allows for making adjustments. The other recommendation I have when you're writing an ecological report and trying to translate it over to planning is to make sure you're practical and achievable in terms of your recommendations. Whether we like it or not, the decision-making process in the planning system is political. Elected representatives ultimately make the decisions, not staff. You're making recommendations. And the decision makers may not have your level of expertise in certain issues, and they may not have your passion relative to certain issues as well. They also, you have to keep in mind, have to weigh off your recommendations against other socioeconomic considerations. So this is where, if you're making practical and achievable recommendations, you're likely to get more traction. Part of being practical and achievable is explaining matters to your audience at an appropriate technical level. We know that there's often a lot of technical language, both in ecology and planning. Again, the decision makers, you want to make sure they understand the decisions they're making, your recommendations. So try to, don't be afraid to simplify to get the point across. And also a big key is to identify the positive benefits for all parties when you're making recommendations. Now, another approach that I always advocate relative to looking at ecology in planning is one of using an objectives-based planning approach versus a rules-based planning approach. And I have a graphic here that I'm hoping to use to illustrate that. The red rectangular area that you would see on the screen was an agricultural parcel being farmed, and they wanted to acquire the adjacent agricultural parcel to add to the farm property, but there was an existing home in the green circled area, and they wanted to sever that off as a surplus dwelling. Now, when this property was first looked at relative to compliance with provincial policies, upper tier policies, and so on, the rules would tell you that the agricultural consent to allow severance of the surplus farm dwelling should make the lot as small as possible to maximize the amount of agricultural land, to minimize the size of any lot being created. But when you put it into the larger context, a different picture emerges. This parcel is located along a small watercourse that connects to the Minising wetlands and then connects to a large natural heritage system to the west and ultimately over to the Niagara Escarpment further to the west. And that small watercourse on the property had been degraded. There was no vegetation cover along the watercourse and so on. So looking at objectives-based approach rather than a rules-based approach, you could see where perhaps a larger lot was merited to allow for capturing the stream going through the site and doing some rehabilitation along that stream. And we end up achieving multiple objectives here. We get the prime agricultural land appropriately consolidated. We end up creating a much healthier corridor linkage between the natural heritage features, and the lot is able to be created as a surplus dwelling lot. So I really advocate looking at a objectives-based approach when you do your work and your recommendations, and looking at the larger context to look at, is there more than one objective that can be achieved here? And that certainly helps in terms of going to the decision makers and saying, listen, we can do more than one thing here. We can achieve multiple objectives and have a really positive impact. Now, I've gone through this part of it fairly quickly, and that's because we're going through a lot of material today, and I'll try to slow down a little bit. I know I've probably at the beginning of my presentation, I may be speaking a little quickly. So I want to stop here for a minute just to allow for some questions.
Thanks, Michael. We only have one question, and it's really more of I guess, a statement. I think, as everybody knows, the provincial government has introduced Bill 229 and Schedule 6 as it relates to the conservation authorities and what it can be doing. But we're just wondering if you can relate what you're talking about a little bit to those changes, understanding that, you know, the province hasn't come out necessarily with what the mandated programs are and for the conservation authority and what non-mandated is. But I was just wondering that the question really is that, can you, you know, direct that or speak to that as you can in the presentation?
Certainly, I can try to incorporate a little bit of that. The presentation is really focusing more on the planning instruments and how ecology can be implemented effectively in that. Obviously, a big part of that is making sure you get lots of input by the experts. And that includes conservation authorities playing a key role in providing watershed and integrated watershed science. So in my view, conservation authorities are essential to the process, and any proposed changes that would interfere with getting the best watershed science into planning decisions, I think is a negative exercise. I don't think it's positive. I know there are a number of issues that are attempted to be addressed in the changes to the Conservation Authorities Act, but I'm not sure that the changes that are being proposed at this time are the positive ones that are needed to make this work well. Fundamentally, we need good watershed science. We need as much expertise as we can in making these planning decisions. And I think hopefully the changes will reflect that when they're finally put forward.
Thank you. Just one more question here is, can you give any indication of how an objective-based approach may have stood the test against what often rules-based frameworks that there are? Example, what the LPAT's looking for?
Certainly, yes. And I just came fresh out of 2 LPAT hearings, so I can certainly appreciate that question. In terms of looking at an objectives-based approach, I think it's really important to lay the framework, lay out the context in which you're doing that, to demonstrate that you're achieving multiple policy objectives. And yes, while the focus may be on one particular aspect at a hearing, if you can adequately demonstrate the tie-in and show that you're not taking away from one objective to achieve multiple objectives, I think you have a chance for success. It does mean that the people that are looking at it, the decision makers, have to think a little bit out of the box, have to think a little bit broader picture. And that's where your role as an ecologist or planner is essential, to give them that broader picture. When I showed the visuals there of what was going on, if we were looking just solely at the property, we probably wouldn't have recognized that there was a larger picture here that could achieve multiple objectives. When you zoom out and look at what's going on around the property, consider all of the objectives of the official plan, all of the vision of the official plan, you can make, believe a successful argument to say more than one objective can be met here. We know we're tweaking the rules just a little bit on one objective, but that's to achieve multiple objectives, and there's a net gain for everything and nothing loses. Agricultural land still protected as well. So you have to make a good argument, a convincing argument, but I think it's a worthwhile exercise.
Awesome, thank you very much. The next question I have, and we have a couple more minutes here, regarding the last slide in your presentation, would there be measurables identified for the proposed residential lot to ensure that rehab of the waterway actually occurs? So how do you, I guess, how do you measure that? How do you monitor that?
Right, so that's a key element, and that goes to the very heart of the presentation, and that is, how do you make sure it effectively occurs? And part of that is we're dealing with a consent. So with the consent, and now we're jumping ahead in the presentation, but a consent allows you to set conditions. And one of those conditions can be a development agreement. And development agreements, again, jumping ahead in the presentation, there's also, when you have a development agreement, you can also enter in separate agreements entirely separate from the Planning Act under the Municipal Act with any party that's willing to do so. And that's where, when you're looking at multiple objectives, you're also looking at the applicant and saying, you have an objective, you want to achieve something, here's how we can achieve it. But that means you may have to enter in voluntarily into an additional agreement that involves, for example, an agreement to do rehabilitation in this area. You can make it part of the conditions of consent, but you could also have an additional agreement that deals with that. So it's getting all the parties together, recognizing all their objectives, and then finding the right instruments to make it happen.
There's one question here, Michael, that we have, and I'm not really sure how to answer it, but I'll put it to you anyway. It's, are there any LPAT cases where you saw this objectives-based approach be utilized that were upheld? And is there a way that we can perhaps provide some examples of those too? I don't think we can provide them now, but a way to provide some listing of those examples where that approach has been upheld.
certainly there was a case that I was involved in involving compensation, ecological compensation, and that's a whole other topic I could talk about quite a bit. I'll be touching on it in this presentation because I think it's a valuable tool, but it has to be done very carefully. But in that case, we were able to achieve multiple objectives, looking at the broader picture, using a net gain approach in terms of compensation. And it was entirely an objectives-based approach that started that whole process of looking at things in a broader fashion. And I don't want to give away even more slides coming up in the presentation at this point than necessary, but we were able to achieve a lot of things, and that went through a hearing process. It also went actually through a judicial review and went through both of those successfully and is being implemented on the ground. So it can work, and it's certainly, presents some extra challenges in terms of having that broader view. But again, in my mind, it's very worthwhile.
Okay. Well, we have some questions here still, but a lot of them I think will relate to other aspects in your presentation. But just to kind of, they're asking the questions about the difference between site plan and official plan and that sort of stuff. So I think you'll cover that in your presentation. So I'd suggest, Michael, that we move on to the presentation 2 here, and I'll sign off and leave it to you.
Certainly, thank you. And we really appreciate the questions. In fact, one of the things that we struggled with in putting this presentation together was we wanted to create a slideshow that covered all the content, but the back and forth and the questions are really important. We want to respond to what you want to hear about, what what you're interested in, and so on. So I am going to go through some of the slides again, and we will stop again for questions. And so keep asking those questions. I actually enjoyed that part of the presentation more than going through the slides themselves. So we'll start with official plans and official plan amendments. So what is an official plan? Well, an official plan sets out the vision for the community. It establishes all the policies that govern the municipal planning decisions. And a really important piece of this is Section 24 of the Planning Act, which says that all public expenditures and bylaws must conform to the official plan. So it's not just about that land use planning, which everybody focuses on, but it basically is saying when they pass a budget, when they make public expenditures at council and pass all sorts of bylaws, they must conform to the official plan. So it's a much larger document than just dealing with the land use planning issues, which is quite a challenge in and of itself. Now, official plans have to be reviewed at first every 10 years and then every 5 years. That's being adjusted a little over time to account for the fact that we keep reviewing the plans anyway for conformity exercises. Now, there are some limitations in terms of the ability to amend a plan. After initial approval, there's a 2-year limitation. Mind you, that can be altered somewhat depending on certain circumstances. We don't need to get into the details of that right now, but while this is a municipal planning document and vision, you have to also keep in mind that it's shaped by provincial policies and plans as well as upper tier plans, where there's a 2-tier system. Those are consistency, conformity type exercises and so on. So what I often say to local councils is, listen, there's a whole bunch of information, policies, etc., that are set up by the province. You have to comply with those. There's a whole other bunch that is set up by the upper tier. And then you have left what you can shape locally. And that's still a fair amount of territory, but you have to keep in mind a lot of the basic parameters are established at the provincial level and the upper tier level before you get to that local official plan level. And you can't conflict with those upper tiers. Other than that, you can be more restrictive in some cases in terms of what you want to achieve locally, or more directive in terms of what you want to achieve locally in your official plan. Now, official plans are developed and amended through a public process. Official plans are also open to a level of interpretation and have some inherent flexibility. And there are appeal rights both in the development of an official plan as well as amendments to official plans. Now, how then does an official plan play out in terms of opportunities available for ecology to influence planning? And the opportunities really depend on what's involved. So is this a municipally initiated comprehensive official plan update or a secondary plan? Or is this a private application for an official plan amendment? The opportunities to some degree are similar, but they also vary based upon these circumstances. So we'll deal first with a comprehensive official plan or secondary plan and the opportunities that are presented there. Here, you really are at that proactive stage. This is the fundamental stage of protecting natural heritage. The ability to effectively manage natural heritage through the planning process really depends on what happens here. Your official plan, as I said, sets out your vision, sets out all the policies, the land use framework, influences all municipal decisions over a period of time. So this is the fundamental stage at which you can do natural heritage planning and have a really positive impact from that standpoint. And I always encourage the public to keep that in mind as well. Unfortunately, when we have public meetings about official plans, very few people attend those meetings and provide input. It's when the subdivision's happening next door that we, suddenly get 100 people at a meeting. But when we're talking about the official plan, you may only have a handful of people at the meeting. And yet this is the fundamental vision. If you get it right here, that sets the framework for the next 10, 20 years or more. So what are the opportunities when you look at an official plan? What can you do in an official plan to protect natural heritage? One of the fundamental steps is identifying and mapping the natural heritage system. And we've gone away from that features approach to a systems approach, which is a much more comprehensive and integrated approach. So you map both features and systems. You also want to think about when you're mapping that, whether you want a single designation approach or whether you want to do a layered and tiered designation approach. This has particularly come to mind relative to woodlands, where previously significant woodlands were a factor to be considered. They were not, however, an outright restriction on development, but under the growth plan now, significant woodlands and a buffer around those can be a total outright restriction on development. And that puts them in a bit of a different context. A lot of woodlands were previously mapped as significant, but may have included areas that weren't particularly significant, plantation areas, things like that. And I think there's now a merit in looking at woodlands a slightly different way and saying, okay, there's going to potentially be a subset of woodlands that should achieve this ultimate protection, where you're just not allowed to develop, you're not allowed to develop in it or adjacent to it within that vegetated buffer. And then there may be a local set of woodlands that should still be protected, but maybe has a little more flexibility, similar to that which occurred under the previous regime when it wasn't an outright prohibition on development. However, keep in mind that that's a municipal approach, a municipal decision that has to be made. Should you do a two-tiered system? Should you just keep it a single tier? How do you want to deal with? Those are the types of decisions you have to make when you're mapping these systems and establishing your policy. You also have to think about, when you do put those designations in the plan, how they can be interpreted. What are the rules of interpretation? If you want to think about the errors in mapping, how will they be corrected? Will policy apply to features regardless of mapping errors? For example, in the official plan I worked on when I was director of planning at a municipality, we put in policy that said, if we make a mistake and we leave out a natural heritage feature, the policies will nevertheless apply to that natural heritage feature. Just because we accidentally left it out of the mapping doesn't mean it's not important, doesn't not mean it shouldn't be considered. But that went the other way as well. If we mistakenly mapped an area, we also tried to facilitate a process to correct that wasn't overly onerous. That was just to be fair. What's important is protecting the natural heritage system. So if you're going to have leeway to allow for better protection, you should also have leeway where you've made an error and incorporated something that perhaps shouldn't have been incorporated. So those are things you want to think about when you do your mapping. It's not just doing the map, but how's that map going to be used? How is it going to be interpreted? How are you going to make changes to the mapping? You also, in your official plan, to develop goals and objectives for land use management of the natural heritage system. You get to establish your vision for the management of the system, and the purpose of including it into the official plan. This is where you really want to think about what do you want to achieve? Protection, enhancement, rehabilitation, how robust a natural heritage system policy do you want to have, and how structured do you want to be in that, and thinking about all the different components that you want to achieve. And again, keeping in mind that Section 24 of the Planning Act, that your natural heritage system policies and framework go beyond just the land use planning to even public works projects, the way that council is going to set up its budget and approve expenditures and so on. Keep in mind that municipal management activities, public works, land acquisition, and so on must all conform to your official plan. So set your goals and objectives accordingly in your official plan. This is going to be your guiding document, as I say, for 10, 20 years or more. Now, the other part of an official plan, of course, is establishing policy. And you want to set out policy for municipal management of the natural heritage system. What is the municipal vision? What are the intentions? What are the approach? You also want to establish permitted uses within the natural heritage system. And again, this is particularly important where you have a tiered policy approach, where you may have layers of permitted uses for the various tiers within your natural heritage system. You want to set out policy for development application review. Are OPAs or ZBAs required for certain permitted activities within the natural heritage system? Again, more appropriate probably to a tiered type system. What are the official plan amendment application requirements? What are the study requirements? What input process is required to amend the official plan when it comes to your natural heritage system? And then you should be establishing policy for environmental impact studies or natural heritage assessments. What is the expected content, the establishment of terms of reference, guidelines, etc. Some of that will be policy in your document, and some of it will be policy that refers to guidelines that the municipality may develop for applicants. So the policy, for example, might say an environmental impact study shall be required in accordance with the guidelines for such studies that are published by the municipality. You also should be setting out policy in your plan for municipal acquisition and disposition. If the municipality is going to be acquiring lands, say how, what type of lands the municipality may be interested in relative to the natural heritage system and so on, and how those will be acquired, usually through several means. The municipality should also consider the disposal of lands within natural heritage features, for example, road allowances, etc. How will you handle disposal? Are you willing to dispose of lands, declare them surplus if they're part of the natural heritage system, or are you not? Are you going to prohibit the disposition of municipal lands when they're within the natural heritage system, for example? So you may want to provide some guidance on disposition of municipal lands in your policies. And you should also be addressing in your official plan public involvement, public input, management, and incorporation to a limited degree in the official plan, but that could again be just a vehicle to allow that occur as part of a broader municipal program of encouraging citizen science and citizen involvement. When I talk to groups about effective engagement with municipalities and natural heritage protection, part of it is getting out there, influencing the official plan. And another big part of it is engaging with your council, engaging with your local planners in terms of environmental and ecological knowledge. Bring that knowledge forward. The more information decision makers have, the better. And from a municipal perspective, leveraging all of that input, leveraging all of that goodwill is incredibly important as well. It can really support municipal programs, municipal decisions, and so on, having citizens on side because they've been involved in what you're doing in terms of the natural heritage aspect of management of the municipality. Some important tools that you can use in developing your recommendations. This is just a very limited set of them, but there's some great tools. Obviously, the provincial tools in terms of the Natural Heritage Reference Manual, the Significant Wildlife Habitat Guidelines, and a whole series of other guidelines. There's also the provincial plans that give some good information relative to natural heritage systems and accompanying technical guidelines for those. Another great document is the Best Practices Guide for Natural Heritage Systems Planning. That was a review of official plans carried out throughout the province by Ontario Nature and establishing a whole series of best practices set around a series of principles. A really good document to refer to. You, of course, have the federal how much habitat is enough guidelines, and then as well the how much disturbance is too much guidelines as well for the northern areas. And then there's the Biodiversity Atlas, which is a really interesting tool. And there's many more tools as well. I just wanted to give you a highlight of some of the key ones. And there's a link here that you can follow to access some of those documents. Now, the other thing I wanted to talk about quickly here in terms of official plan policy is developing robust policies around compensation. Compensation is increasingly looked at as a tool in ecology, and that has some pros and cons associated with it. Again, I could probably talk quite a bit about that. It's a controversial tool, and I think it has to be used very carefully. There's lots of room for making bad decisions when you utilize compensation as well. So some of the opportunities, certainly economic opportunities, engages developers. It's a lot easier for them to navigate compensation than some other frameworks. It provides, in terms of economic aspects of cash in lieu, for example, it provides funding for conservation work. It provides competitive advantage. It facilitates growth and development and so on. Environmentally, there's a possibility of net gain, adaptability, and resiliency, particularly in the face of climate change. However, there's some substantial risks and challenges. When I first looked at the whole issue of compensation and preparing some presentations for a series of workshops we were doing across Ontario with Ontario Nature, I was doing some research on compensation and the experience in other jurisdictions, and some consistent themes came across in that, particularly in Europe, for example, where some of the risks included economic dependency, inequity and misappropriation, and then the funding shell game, where funds to be utilized for compensation, really that's supposed to be going towards creating habitat and managing species, instead went to cover administrative costs, and not much ended up going in on the ground. Some environmental risks as well, unexpected losses or uncertain gains, time lags, measuring and accessing success, unexpected consequences and longer term impacts, and the inability to properly factor in climate change impacts, particularly when you're trying to create habitats. What are you trying to create, a habitat for the current climate or the one that's going to be here 20 years from now? So we developed some key principles relative to the utilization of the compensation tool, and that is that there should be really a hierarchy there, avoidance and mitigation being the first choice as opposed to jumping straight to compensation. I also advocate a net gain approach versus a no net loss approach, and that there should be limits set to offsetting. Also, you need some rules around establishing equivalence. What is it you're getting, and are you really getting the equivalent? You should also be looking at the duration of offsets. How long is it going to take to get them, and are they permanently there and secured? The location, things like conservation banking, fully covering the cost of offsets, making sure you've got proper engagement, and above all, being transparent in the process, transparent about where funds are going if you're using financial compensation and so on. So that deals with official plans, that broad vision, broad policy approach. In terms of official plan amendments, the opportunities there are really a two-stage process. The first one is, should the OPA even be approved? If this is the fundamental question, if the ecological or natural harm is too significant, then maybe you don't need to be thinking about mitigation. Maybe it's the avoidance, and the OPA shouldn't be approved. If not, if the OPA is appropriate, then, or if it's not appropriate, sorry, if you're going to make that decision, you should be absolutely clear about why it's not appropriate. And you should make sure that your recommendations go back very directly to the PPS and the relevant provincial policies, because if you don't link those to the relevant plans and policies, they will certainly be challenged. Not that they won't be challenged anyway, but you're going to be on much stronger footing if you can relate them directly back to that. And the next step then is demonstrating how the approval would not be consistent and would not conform. And if you're doing that, think about the possibility of making recommendations regarding alternatives. It's not nice to tell people no, just a blank face no. It's a lot better, again, if you can think out of the box, if you can look at the broader objectives and say, are there different ways to achieve this? Is there something that can change, that we can turn this into a positive and where everybody's objectives can be met? Now, the second stage is, if you've looked at the OPA and you say, yes, we can proceed with this OPA, then you should be very clear about the permitted uses that are appropriate. So be absolutely clear about what you're recommending approval on or approval of, and then set out any special policy that may be needed. Like, for example, a requirement for specific studies or monitoring requirements. Be clear in the extent and nature of the alteration to the designation, and as specific as possible in regarding the interpretation of the designations being established. Also, if you want lines to be definitive, if you're drawing lines on a map at an OPA stage, they should be definitive. You should have a lot more information at your hands than when you're doing a general comprehensive official plan. And therefore, you may want to establish some policy in that OPA that counteracts the inherent flexibility and existing interpretation clauses in an OP. If you're confident about those boundaries, then you don't want it ended up being some uncertainty around that by not addressing the interpretation clauses within the official plan. Also remember that OPAs are not temporary. They establish a long-lasting land use permission. If the actual land use change may not be immediately forthcoming, you want to establish policies that require updates to information or require a full review at some point. Recommendations may change over time. For example, I once dealt with a plan of subdivision that reemerged after 30 years. The approval authority had transferred between the province and the upper tier and down to the local municipality, but that subdivision had disappeared in that entire process, only to come forth with the new landowner who still had a very valid approval. And of course, the planning circumstances were completely different at that time, and we had to make some adjustments. So when you're doing an OPA, keep in mind that that has a long-lasting life, and you may want to build in some requirement for review at some stage if it's not acted upon in a short period or a reasonable period of time. And again, we'll stop here for some questions.
Thanks, Michael. That's a tremendous amount of information in a relatively short period of time, certainly. So and kind of being cognizant of time, I'll ask some questions here just to lead us through. But do you have any notable examples experience with prescribing targets for ecological and natural heritage enhancements in official plan policy?
The in official plan policy, it's a new area because the official plan, most official plan policies are still stuck in the old system, even of not having full, robust natural heritage systems identified. When we've done some work looking at that as through the best practices manual, we found that by far the majority of official plans were still based on that features approach as opposed to the systems approach. More and more that's changing. And as you develop the systems approach, some of those great tools are out there. For example, the how much habitat is enough guidelines is very much a target-based approach system where you can establish those targets for how much of the natural heritage landscape, the certain aspects you want within that system and you're trying to protect and goals you're trying to achieve. Do I have examples? Unfortunately, I don't have any particular examples that I would say are where we want to be at. And I think that's the challenge out there to everybody. Let's start creating those documents. Let's update those official plans. Let's use those tools that are available to us. When we looked at the utilization of the how much habitat is enough guidelines, we were surprised that while there was a fair amount of awareness of them, there wasn't a lot of utilization of them. And yet it's such a great tool to help you set those forecasts and targets within your municipalities. So I think that's the real challenge, is start to get this into your OPs and your background studies and so on. Look at measurable targets, look at the ability to achieve that success. And this is where you want to leverage citizen science as well, because when it comes to monitoring, municipal budgets are taxed. But in terms of monitoring exercises and so on, think out of the box. Use your ability for applicants and citizens to help in that activity, and look at success down the road in terms of what you're achieving.
Okay, thanks very much for that. Just the next question we have is that coming from Conservation Authority planners, they deal with municipalities that do not have natural heritage system mapping and are not prioritized to be undertaken and implemented. How can we encourage our municipal partners to invest in this required mapping?
Well, one of the key points there is to point out that it's a requirement of the provincial policy statement. Natural heritage systems identification is a requirement. It should be part of any comprehensive review of the official plan that's being undertaken. It's part of the provincial interest, and frankly, it should be a municipal interest as well. It's having a natural, robust system is so important for the health, not only of the natural heritage system itself, but there's huge interrelationships that occur with the agricultural community. The benefits of that natural heritage system in terms of the agricultural community can't be understated, in terms of the effects it has in terms of allowing for natural predators to help with pest control, the dynamics in terms of the water system, etc., and the interplay between natural heritage and agricultural systems. And that's why the natural heritage system right now recognizes that agriculture and natural features go together. They're not to be separated. They go together, and you need to think about them in a bigger picture point of view. Natural heritage is incredibly important for open space, which is valuable, and all the more so now as we've seen with COVID, where access to natural open space is incredibly important for people. It's important for a whole range of reasons. And I think you just have to motivate your council, educate your council. And again, this is going back to that involvement of the citizens, making sure people get involved in the official plan. If you've got 6 people coming to your official plan public meeting and not saying too much, council isn't getting that feedback, isn't getting that input. If you've got a bunch of people that are motivated to get natural heritage system planning in place and be active in that, and go to council and demand that that's there, then it's more likely to happen as well.
Okay, I think we'll just go with one more question in the interest of time here, Michael, and it is, can you comment on the advantages, disadvantages of including natural heritage system mapping in an OP as a map versus a schedule?
Okay, so really fundamentally that comes down to how you structure your policy. So if you've got it as a map that's unrelated to specific designation and associated policy, it's background information. If you relate it to policy and relate it to designations in the schedule, it's got that grounding in policy, and it's therefore much more effective in terms of the decision-making process. That's not to say that you shouldn't have information available, but I often believe that in the official plan, you really need to focus on the policies and the schedules, the things that are part of the official plan have meaning, result in decisions, result in guidance being specifically given. Something that's a piece of information can be included in a background study or can be included in an annotated version of your official plan. We're seeing that happen more and more with planning documents, where you get the legal document that focuses on what legally has to be in that document, and then you get an annotated document that has some explanation, some background. It's a little friendlier in terms of the public utilization and so on. But make sure that when you're using, when you want it to relate directly to policy, make sure that the mapping relates back directly to that policy and refers to it. And that's best done through the schedules.
Okay, I think I'm going to call it on the questions, Michael. We're running a little bit behind schedule, so
Sure.
I'm just going to hand it over to you for the next aspect on the zoning bylaw amendments, and minor variances.
Certainly.
And I'll get off the screen.
So we're going to go on to zoning bylaws, zoning bylaw amendments, and minor variances. And I know the comment was just made at the beginning of the questions there that we're running through a lot of material very quickly, and we are. My apologies for that. We're trying to stay on time. We're trying to cover a lot of ground. And when I was preparing for this, I was thinking, well, you know, each one of these topics we could spend an entire day on, and we're going to squeeze it into 2 hours. So yes, you're getting an overview. Hopefully we're sharing some information that that gets you thinking about some areas, and I'm always happy to answer questions, and people can follow up with me if they wish. I'm more than happy to share my experiences and learn from your experience. That dialogue is great. I learn every day. I've been in the business for a long time, but I still learn every day. So what is a comprehensive zoning bylaw? Effectively, it's local legislation. It implements your official plan policies. So your official plan is that broad vision, your broad policy. It's got a lot of flexibility. You might want to call it more of a feel-good document. The comprehensive zoning bylaw is where the rubber hits the road. This is what implements your official plan. It's a quasi-legal document, basically. It establishes your zones and provisions specific to the zones, as well as general provisions. So you have zones that are associated with your designations. You have provisions within those zones that say how big a lot has to be, what your yards have to be, how many parking spaces you need, so on. And then you have general provisions that apply throughout the zoning bylaw and address various issues. Now, those general provisions can also include setbacks. For example, mandatory setbacks from the top of bank of a water course, etc. Comprehensive zoning bylaw can be amended by the municipality or private applications. Again, there is a limitation when you first have a new comprehensive zoning bylaw. And again, with that limitation, there's some exceptions as well. That's always the case in planning. You set the rules and then there's some exceptions. Now, again, they can be developed and amended through a public process. The wording in bylaws is very precise and critical. And there's a whole series of definitions, the terminology and so on, and you really have to pay attention to the wording. It's actually quite difficult to work on a new comprehensive zoning bylaw, because if you make one change to a word over here, it can have huge implications in another part of the document based upon that word also being there and having some import relative to that, and then the definitions and so on. So it's a rigid document. It's very precise. Wording is very critical, and you have to think about what you mean when you use every word and put it into that document. There are appeal rights to official plans and to zoning bylaws and zoning bylaw amendments, similar to the OP. Now, again, what are the opportunities for putting ecology into those documents? It depends on if you're preparing a new comprehensive zoning bylaw or you're preparing or dealing with a zoning amendment, similar to the official plan exercise. So when you're doing a new comprehensive zoning bylaw, the opportunities available for ecology to influence that are, again, segregated out into a number of aspects of that document. So again, we'll start with the mapping. Mapping's done through schedules, zoning bylaw schedules. The mapping should be as accurate as possible and justifiable. Here, the lines are fairly definitive. Yes, there's an interpretation clause, and lines have to be interpreted subject to that clause, but the mapping here has much more rigidity to it than it would in the official plan. You also want to think about whether or not you want to just establish those zone designations in the schedules, or whether you want to use overlays as well. You can have an overlay zone that says, basically, notwithstanding the uses that are permitted within this schedule, this overlay applies over top of that and may have some limitation on those uses. But you have to really think carefully then about the interaction of those overlays with the mapping below that overlay. So when you put the overlay on top of a whole range of different uses, that could have different interactions to those uses. So you really need to contemplate that. You also need, again, clear interpretation provisions regarding the boundaries. A common clause in many zoning bylaws, or provision in many zoning bylaws, is that the zone goes to the center of the line of a road or to a property line. Well, when you're dealing with natural heritage features, that may not work so well. You may want to have a specific clause in terms of how boundaries are to be dealt with when interpreting the EP zones related to woodlands, things like that. You also then in your zoning establish permitted uses. The key here is to make sure that when you establish appropriate uses, you do so relative to thinking about the ecology, the natural heritage system. Again, if you have tiered environmental zones, have particular uses related to those different tiers. Keep in mind your uses should conform to the OP. You've got to relate it back to what you've said in your official plan. That's why that's such a key document. Now, many of the old zoning bylaws never used to do this. They just would designate an area as open space or conservation or something like that, and then allow a whole bunch of uses like golf courses, etc. At this point in time, looking at provincial policy, natural heritage systems, and so on, you really need to differentiate between what's natural hazards versus natural heritage, and then what's open space versus environmentally protected. Those have different implications. Yes, natural hazards are obviously important, but natural hazards may cover areas that are partially developed. They may cover agricultural lands as well as natural features, whereas natural heritage is a more unique subset of land uses potentially. Excuse me. And open space versus environmentally protected. Often the open space zone allows for a whole bunch of uses that would not necessarily be appropriate in the natural heritage system. So you really need to differentiate between these as opposed to throwing it all under one simple zone. Now, again, once you've got that mapping done, you need to establish some provisions. Usually the specific zone provisions are fairly limited. So for example, for your EP zone, you wouldn't necessarily want to have a minimum lot size requirement or a minimum frontage requirement, because many of the EP lands are landlocked parcels or smaller parcels or don't have frontage, and you don't want to require frontage for those. And you usually don't need things like minimum yards because you're not really allowing buildings to be built inside them and so on. So the provisions for the zone provisions are usually fairly limited, other than those that deal with permitted uses when it comes to that. But in the general provisions, that's where you may see more provisions being applied. You can establish setbacks provisions for certain features. So you can have, again, that 30-meter setback, for example, from the top of bank of a water course, those types of things. So the general provisions is a spot where you would really find a lot more of the ecology type provisions. Now, the new thing that's come up relative to minimum vegetation protection zones is that they're a little bit difficult to deal with in zoning bylaws, because they don't really effectively, zoning bylaws don't really effectively control site alteration and vegetation removal. But there are some other planning tools that we'll get to that are very effective in that regard. Now, another part of zoning bylaws is that you have to establish definitions, and you should be very clear with your definitions of the terms you use in your bylaw. And don't just think about that definition, because then you need to go back to the bylaw and say, well, if this is the definition I use, how does that work within the bylaw? How does it interact with the other provisions and the other definitions? Because sometimes you get into this loop of, well, if this says this, then that means this, and then that means this, and then that goes back over here and means this. That's how complicated interpretation of zoning bylaws can get. So when you're writing a definition, think about how it interacts with the other definitions. Think about how it interacts with all the provisions that are set out, so that you can avoid any conflict or issues within the interpretation of the zoning bylaw. For example, a setback may relate to the defined term for buildings in the zoning bylaw. So a zoning bylaw may, when it defines a setback or establishes a setback, it may relate that to buildings for various reasons. But perhaps you also want to capture structures in terms of a setback when it comes to natural heritage features. And that's where, if you just relied on the general definition That's often incorporated in a zoning bylaw for setbacks where it's associated with buildings and you don't think about structures, you're missing that component of it. So when it comes to natural heritage features, you have to look at the provisions relative to the zoning bylaw and what's traditionally being put into zoning bylaws. And keep in mind that often it wasn't thinking about these types of things. Often it was related to buildings or other type situations like that. So you need to think a little bit about how, do we need any adjustment when we're dealing with natural heritage features? Should the setback apply to structures as well as to buildings, for example? Another area in terms of is, of course, the zoning bylaw amendments and what are the opportunities available for there. And again, they're somewhat similar to the comprehensive zoning bylaw, but have some unique aspects relative to the fact that you're dealing with an amendment. Here again, you need to be very precise with the boundaries. What uses are you being allowed to occur here? So when you write the wording of the exception, for example, in an amendment to permitted uses, are those permitted uses replacing the uses, or are they in addition to the uses that are already permitted in the bylaw? You need to think about that. You need to think about, do we need to add any special provisions? Here are the provisions to that zone, but if we're doing an exception to the zone, what are the specific provisions that may be needed here? And again, you have to circle back to definitions, permitted uses, and so on to see how those interact. If you make this change to the bylaw, it has a ripple effect throughout the zoning bylaw in terms of having to look at how does that affect the other definitions, provisions, etc. Now, this is where a notwithstanding clause really comes in useful when you're dealing with exceptions. You have to be careful because it's a super powerful tool as well. A notwithstanding clause basically means that despite what anything else says in the document, the following actually applies. So that can eliminate a lot of the complexities and the interrelationships amongst definitions and wordings of bylaws. So you can say, notwithstanding any other requirement in this bylaw on land zoned EP-3, blah, 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 will apply. It's a great tool because you don't have to worry about all those complexities, but when you just erased everything else in the bylaw, you better make sure that you're covering everything you need to then after that notwithstanding statement. So it's a really good tool to use. It's a very powerful tool, can eliminate some complexities, but it creates its own in that you're replacing everything else in the bylaw with what you're saying. Now, one way to deal with that is to use the notwithstanding clause a little less liberally and say, notwithstanding the requirements of section such and section such, this will be blah, blah, blah. So you're narrowing down that notwithstanding clause and still keeping some of the rest of the applicable portions of the document. So it's a great tool. You can scope it a little bit, be cautious in how you use it, but it can avoid some of those complexities that can occur. Now, we'll go into minor variance. And here, it's basically what's called a minor exception to the bylaw. There are planning tests to be met for a minor variance. It's just not a numerical test. In certain specific circumstances, they allow an exception, usually to the provisions from the established requirements of the zoning. They're supposed to be used for relatively minor purposes, hence the name minor variance. Larger changes need to be an amendment rather than a variance. They are subject to a public process and a hearing, and generally they can be a little faster than the zoning amendment process, and they usually go to a committee of adjustment as opposed to council. Now, the opportunities available for ecology, again, minor variances tend to deal more with such minor things that they often aren't involved in ecological matters, but there may be occasions where they are. So here's some of the things you need to consider in those. Again, the first step is the decision appropriate or not? Should you be granting the minor variance or not? If you are going to grant, be as specific as possible about why the variance is granted or for what the variance is granted for. And then, if appropriate, establish conditions that must be met for the minor variance to be permitted and to apply. So this is one of the planning tools that is a conditional tool. You can establish conditions. But the conditions should be clear and achievable by the applicant. They have to be realistic and they have to be achievable. And they could include things like a development or grading plan. Now, the next subject we're going to go to, which is related to zoning bylaws and so on, is community planning permit bylaws. This is a relatively new tool under the Planning Act, and it's actually a really useful tool as well. It essentially combines zoning, minor variance, and site plans into a single process. Now, you have to lay the groundwork in your OP to utilize it. Again, that's where the OP is so important. You got to establish your policies, have your vision, allow as many tools as possible. And this is one of the tools that you could look at, community planning permit bylaw. It's similar to zoning in that it allows for establishment of zones, permitted uses, provisions, development standards, and so on. But it also adds some things. It results in the issuance of a permit for development. It allows for establishing how much variance to a provision or development standard can be approved by staff or council. It establishes classes of land uses that can be allowed subject to certain conditions. And it established classes of development or uses that are exempt from permit requirements. Now, the adoption of a bylaw is subject to appeal, but once it's in place, only the applicant can appeal a decision or non-decision. That's a bit of a positive for community planning permits, but it's also a bit of a negative because it really limits the public involvement process. Not to say that the issuance of a permit isn't subject to public process. There's often public notification and maybe a public meeting and so on. However, the appeal rights are restricted, similar to the restriction on appeal rights in site plans. Now, the opportunities available for Ecology to influence planning when it comes to community planning permits. Again, it combines the opportunities provided for in zoning, minor variance, and site plan control all in one process. It allows for integration. As well, under community planning permits, development includes site alteration and vegetation removal. So there you have a tool that allows the municipality to deal with grading and vegetation removal and preservation as part of the permit process. A step up from traditional sort of zoning and application of site plan control and so on. So rather than piecemealing different components in different applications, this can be very direct and clear. So for example, along a waterfront, you can control specified width of shoreline buffer, the amount and type of development within the shoreline buffer, studies that may be required to allow conditional development in the shoreline, and conditions that must be met, including things like vegetation retention and even vegetation restoration. So it's a very powerful tool. It has some great advantages in terms of comprehensively dealing with a development proposal and not having to try to fit your recommendations in zoning and then in site plan and then in other measures. This can do it all in one component in terms of issuance of an approval. So a well-written community planning permit bylaw can really set you up well for dealing with natural heritage considerations in the land use planning system. Site plan control. Basically, site plan control does not establish the land use. That's done in your official plan and your zoning bylaw. What site plan control does is it says how the site is going to be developed and how the site is going to be maintained relative to that approved development. And then changes to that plan, if you want to change where the parking is or where the sidewalks is, etc., those require amendments to the site plan. Site plans can be registered on title. They can require development agreements and securities. However, site plans, you might think, well, there's a great tool. Why do we need community planning permit system? There are some limitations set out in the Planning Act in terms of what site plan control can deal with. And they were never really contemplated, again, to deal with natural heritage. We've kind of adapted them a little bit to try to deal with natural heritage matters, but they were really concerned more with the built environment. Things like highway widenings, off-street loading and parking facilities, walkways and ramps, accessibility issues, lighting, walls, fences, hedge, trees, services. So that kind of hard infrastructure, hard surface type aspects. Now, so what are the opportunities available for ecology to influence site planning? You can, in the site plan, specify setbacks and extent of development permitted, show it on the site plan. That has to work, obviously, in coordination with your zoning in terms of the setbacks and provisions established in your zoning. You can, in a site plan, deal with the whole avoidance of introduction of invasive species by specifying the landscaping that's to be not only put in place during construction, but also to be maintained over the life of the site plan. You can specify the use of certain species, natural occurring species or related cultivars. As part of the landscaping, you can specify areas to be left in or rehabilitated and managed to natural cover. You can deal with grading, you can deal with stormwater management, low impact development, and lighting, for example, you can deal with dark sky compliant lighting. You can also deal with bird-friendly building design relative to the exterior components of a building. And you can also deal with matters such as proper waste control. And this is particularly important if you're a municipality where you have bear problems and want to manage those in a responsible natural heritage management manner. Now, again, site plans are subject to development agreements. They can provide for securities to ensure development occurs as it's approved. You can specify guarantee and warranty periods for the release of securities. The agreements can be registered on title and provide for long-term maintenance responsibilities. You can also, to some degree, provide for post-development monitoring and limited mitigation remediation depending on the circumstances. And again, this is where we're stretching site plan control a little bit from what it was originally envisioned. And this is where community planning permit system may be a better and more useful tool, but there are some abilities to achieve this in site plan control as well. And again, we'll stop for questions here.
Thank you. Thanks, Mike. Appreciate it. Lots of questions here, tremendous amount of questions being asked, so everybody's very engaged. We'll do our best to answer some of the questions with Michael live, but we'll also be answering the questions. We have Eric Gilbert and Sarah Hodges here that are kind of monitoring the questions and are answering those that we can't get to. So I guess I'm going to go to some of the ones that are getting a lot of upvotes too. So the first one is, what is your opinion on setting targets for components of the natural heritage system, example woodlands and wetland cover?
Yes, in terms of setting those targets, I think that's important. I think that's an area that you could establish, for example, in the official plans, in your objectives and goals portion of those documents. By setting the targets, you're setting the vision. You're also setting something that can be measured in terms of achievement down the road. And again, there are lots of great documents that you can rely on. And this is a multifaceted approach. It's part of your official plan. And again, that's incredibly important there. You can then translate that over to your decision-making process when you're looking at subdivisions, site plans. Can you help achieve those targets and goals? And then you can also do it in the larger picture in terms of some other tools, which we'll be getting to in a minute in the presentation.
Awesome, Michael, thank you. This next question has got a lot of interest in it, and it's a longer question, so I'll do my best. But the current planning environment in Ontario is very confrontational. Environmental recommendations are challenged at every turn. Decision makers give lip service to the PPS and local OP policy, but decisions often disregard both. There is no provincial oversight and no accountability. As you note, planning decisions are political decisions, and therefore the process is inherently flawed. Political decisions are rarely found in science and best planning practice. Do you have any recommendations for how we bring accountability back to the planning process? Loaded
Sure.
Question, I think, Mike, for sure. But,
Loaded question. Well, yeah. benevolent dictatorship might be one of the solutions, but our decision-making process is political, and that's because our decision-making process has to take into account a whole range of matters. Yes, ecology is important. Yes, natural heritage important. So is affordable housing. so are jobs, so are many other things. And I know one shouldn't trump the other, and pardon me for using that term, but they do all have an importance in terms of the decision-making process. So yes, is it controversial? Is it challenging? Sure it is. But I'm looking at it from the context of my career. When I started my career, there was no natural heritage system planning. The wetland policy came in right around the beginning of my career, if I recall correctly, and that was just wetlands. We weren't dealing, nobody even talked about significant woodlands. Nobody talked about lots of other things. So the reason we have lots of controversy is because we've made so many steps in terms of integrating this into planning. They were never considerations before. Now they are, and yes, they're controversial. And yes, we're going to go back and forth about certain things. But overall, I've seen actually an increase. So I'll give you an example as significant woodlands. As I say, when I started my career, nobody even looked at that aspect. As we moved forward with provincial policy development, we got significant woodlands in place. However, you could still develop within significant woodlands subject to an environmental impact study. Then we got the growth plan in place, which said, no, you cannot develop within significant woodlands. And we had a review of the growth plan. And I thought for sure that was something that was going to be taken out because it's pretty controversial. You're sterilizing an awful lot of land from development with that, and yet it was retained. So yes, there's a lot of controversy. There's going to be a lot of back and forth, but that is part of what we live in as a society. We have to make decisions about what's important. Those have to be collective decisions. They have to be supported by the community. And this is where it's so critical to get good natural heritage input at your official plan stage. This is where it's so critical to engage the public and to go beyond the official plan and go beyond planning as part of natural heritage. So when I worked for a municipality, the township of Clearview, we had an active program in natural heritage that went beyond just the official plan and so on. We created an eco park. And that eco park, we worked with the local high school to develop programming for the local high school to utilize the eco park and for education purposes. And as planners, we went to the high school to talk to students about planning and local ecological matters and so on. So you build that into the community, and if the community's interested in preserving natural heritage, that's going to impact council. Council are the decision makers, but the people who decides on who is in council can have a major influence on that council in terms of saying what they want for their community. So it's a struggle, but that's where you need to leverage the community, get them involved, and they will stand up at council behind you and say, yes, natural heritage is important. We want this looked at. As we know you have a lot of other things to look at, but don't leave this at the bottom of the pile.
Really good answer, Michael. Thank you very much. I think you and I are, I'll say, the same general vintage. So I remember back when I first started my career that, it was fairly simplistic, I guess, as far as what was out there from a natural heritage protection. So we've come a tremendous way. And I think it's important to, I share the frustration sometimes in the question, but there are times where we, perhaps we don't succeed. But when you look at the landscape, and I know I can look around Hamilton as an example and see things where we've made improvements because of policy. So thanks for your answer. The next question I have, I think we have a little bit more time, is could you speak to practical experience and how best to feature buffers in the OP scale so that can carry over effectively into the finer scales?
Sure. So in terms of at the official plan aspect, in terms of buffers, this is again where you set your policy. So you want a fairly robust discussion in there about what type of buffers you want, why they're important, and so on. And again, you back that up in your natural heritage study, you back that up in your general sort of community relations with the community, background documents, etc. But within the official plan, you have to lay the framework for buffer requirements, why they're there, relate them back to goals and objectives, establish some good policy around them. And then that can translate over into your zoning, ideally your community planning permit system, because that's a way more effective aspect in terms of buffers, but it then also translates all the way down. that OP is really important because it affects your zoning, it affects your community planning permit system, it affects consents, it affects subdivision agreements, it affects every single planning tool, because all of those tools have to go back to the official plan for guidance. So lay the framework in your official plan and it'll flow through all those other documents and processes.
Okay, great, thank you. I think I will just go with one more question and then we can go on to the next set. But again, this is a little bit of a longer one. Can you speak to the role of an ecological assessment, i.e. an EIS, in the identification of significant natural features on the ground, example, significant woodlands, specifically when a municipality planning authority has not undertaken or does not have the capacity to undertake a comprehensive review or mapping exercise? Further, how does an EIS reconcile discrepancies in natural heritage features mapping between upper and lower tier municipalities?
So big question, and we deal with that all the time when doing natural heritage studies. When a municipality undertakes a comprehensive exercise for its official plan or zoning bylaw, the resources are limited. That's reality, and we have to use large scale picture, aerial photo mapping, all sorts of large scale tools. We can't get down to that nitty gritty sort of thing that you do when you're dealing with a site and you're dealing with an environmental impact study. So one of the first things is make sure your official plan has that policy that says, what happens if we miss a feature? How are we going to deal with it in policy? Because then when somebody does an environmental impact study and finds something on the site that wasn't identified before, there will be some policy guidance in the document about what to do about that, instead of all of a sudden saying, oh, how do we deal with this now? And this happens all the time. I've been on properties where there have been previous studies, lots of work done on a property, and you still find something new that has to be dealt with. And it can be a challenge, and you have to then identify that, put it through the system, utilize the tools you can. Hopefully there's that policy in the official plan that backs you up. But the reality is provincial policy sits over top of that official plan. And if it's a matter of provincial interest that's being identified, significant wildlife habitat, wetlands, etc., you can lay your hat on that provincial policy statement at the very least in terms of justifying why that matter has to be dealt with and appropriately dealt with in whatever instrument you're dealing with. You may have a limited set of tools depending on whether you're dealing with a consent or a subdivision or a site plan. But again, if the official plan was structured properly, there's policy that would apply to that feature if you find it. If not, you can rely on the provincial policy statement, because every decision still has to be consistent with the provincial policy statement, regardless of whether the official plan captured it or not. And I deal with that all the time. And yes, it can be a bit frustrating and a bit challenging, but you look at the various tools you're dealing with, utilize those to the best degree you can. And the important thing is awareness of what's there, explain why it's important, explain how it was found, make sure you have it all fully justified in terms of the documentation, what you found, why it's important, how it fits with that provincial policy framework, if that's what you have to use to end up protecting it. A lot of these answers are very quick, short answers just because of time. Obviously, some of these can be expanded upon. And again, I'm more than happy to address questions after this. People often give me a call or send me an email and I try to respond.
Great, thanks very much, Michael. I'll move on to presentation 4.
Pardon me, oh, the next, yeah. Okay, so next we're going to subdivisions, condominiums, and consents. And again, unfortunately, we'll go through this fairly quickly to stay on time, but plan of subdivision and condominium, what is it? So it controls the division of lands and property and provides for freehold tenure in the case of subdivisions, etc. Ensure land is suitable for the proposed use. It must conform to the official plan and zoning. A stage process, with the first stage being draft approval. Draft approval is conditional. That means that the subdivision approved upon meeting a whole series of conditions. The municipality and other agencies can establish conditions that must be met prior to the final approval. The conditions can also establish requirements for clearance letters from agencies. This goes back to the conversation at the very outset relative to the role of conservation authorities. And the subdivision agreement is entered into as part of the final process. And that agreement is registered on title. As part of the subdivision process, you can require securities, you can require guarantees, warranties, warning clauses, and restrictions on title. The lots are registered and can be transferred on final approval, although lot sales can occur following draft approval. What are the opportunities available to influence, for Ecology to influence planning? So the first part is you're establishing lotting, blocks, road pattern. You're establishing what the development is going to look like. Here's the opportunity then for avoidance. Minimize stream crossings and division of natural areas. Maintain as many corridors as possible. Don't create sinks, but what I mean by sinks is there was an instance, for example, where it was felt very important to preserve a small little wetland pocket, but the entire thing was surrounded by development eventually. And what they found was there was so much road mortality because this little pond was attracting wildlife that it effectively created a biological sink in terms of loss of productivity and wildlife numbers. It actually ended up being a negative thing to maintain this. Unless you can establish and maintain the corridors and the connectivity, be really careful about that aspect. This is also where you establish parkland and trails, and parkland doesn't always have to be fully developed, cleared, etc. People enjoy being able to walk through woodlands and other naturalized areas or natural areas. So think about that and think about parkland in much broader terms, and your trail infrastructure as well. You're also dealing here with grading, stormwater management, low impact development, and other innovative techniques to incorporate ecological considerations. So you have a real opportunity here to have some impact in terms of how that neighborhood's going to look and how it's going to be developed. Think about things like street trees and landscaping. When you're looking at street trees, try to avoid obviously invasive species, ideally require natural species or related cultivars. And another thing a lot of municipalities don't consider about is this prevalence towards trees that produce a lot of pollen. Many of the trees species that we have are separated as males and female trees. Male trees produce a lot of pollen, and there's some really good guidance in terms of avoiding excessive pollen production and the associated impacts in your community in terms of allergies, asthma, etc. And one of the reasons that municipalities focused on male tree species is that they don't produce all the fruit that has to be cleared off of sidewalks and streets and things like that. And in some municipalities, you know, up to 70, 80% of the tree cover can be dominated by pollen producing trees, resulting in issues with allergies and things like that. So think about those things as well when you're looking at street trees. Of course, naturalization of stormwater ponds and open space is an excellent opportunity to bring nature into the subdivision and to achieve some natural heritage objectives. Consider fencing where and what type for stormwater areas and open space. Is it wildlife friendly fencing? Do you always need the fencing, etc.? Again, you can utilize warning clauses or restrictions as part of the registration on title. You can also incorporate innovative components through agreement. You can do things like public signage to inform people about the natural heritage area, the benefits, etc. Public education materials. I was involved in one process approval where a book was created and distributed relative to not natural heritage. In that case, it was about the history of the community, but you could do something for natural heritage as well. So you could say, well, you know, this subdivision is next to this natural heritage feature. Here's what's in this feature, et cetera. It's a great marketing tool as well. You can see that in the names of subdivisions. You know, they often want to relate it back to some sort of natural heritage feature. Well, if you're going to do that, then perhaps you should add to that by producing some sort of literature or public education material that really speaks to that as well as part of the marketing. And that the developer should do, but there are ways to talk to them about doing that through cooperation through the development agreement and so on. Now, another part of land division is that of consents. And this basically is smaller scale land division. You're usually talking about creating 1 or 2 lots here. It can also consist of technical consents to alter lot boundaries and other land transfers, including long-term leases and so on. Many of the same considerations of subdivision planning go into the approval of a consent, but at a scoped scale, because you're dealing obviously with a smaller site. These are usually as well approved by the Committee of Adjustment following a public process and a hearing. And just as with the subdivision agreement, the decision is a draft approval or provisional approval subject to conditions. A consent cannot be finalized or registered until all of the conditions have been met. So similar to a plan of subdivision in terms of the opportunity to incorporate ecology, you have to consider the appropriateness of the lots to be created. Should the lot be created or not? Is the boundary appropriate or not? And then you can establish conditions which must be met. And now keep in mind again, the test here is that the conditions have to be achievable. You can't set a condition that cannot be achieved. Again, you can require a development agreement, and that can require matters to be registered on title. Again, scoped to the nature and scale of the application. So here, again, we're going to stop for questions. We are going through this quickly because we still have some more material to go over, and we want to leave some time for questions at the end as well.
Thanks, Michael. Just a couple of questions here. The one, this is a little bit more of a lengthier one with a fair amount of upvoting for it. So can you comment on the recent and significant increase of use of ministerial orders, zoning orders by municipalities and developers as a means of overriding official plan policies that prohibit development within the natural heritage system? Building upon previous comments, how would you recommend bringing greater accountability and attention to those land use planning decisions? I guess to clarify, it's not the municipality that's making those orders, it's the province that through the minister that makes those orders. But if you have any comments on that.
Yes, that's correct. Again, that's a relatively, minister zoning orders have been around for a long time. How they're being utilized now is a little bit different than how they were utilized previously. And there's a more recent phenomenon in the frequency of minister zoning orders as well. You're right, it's a provincial thing. It is obviously a hot topic, somewhat of a politically sensitive topic as well. My view on minister zoning orders is that they should be used at a minimum. They should be used only when, when appropriate relative to the original intent of minister zoning orders. I do think that setting aside municipal process, setting aside public process, et cetera, raises concerns, not just with those individual developments, but raises a broader concern in society about the fairness of the planning system and public involvement in the planning system. And although I've seen a general improvement in terms of natural heritage being incorporated in planning, I'm a little concerned about where things are headed relative to public involvement. When I started my career, there was lots of opportunity for the public to be involved in planning. And as a result, you had lots of discussion about things like NIMBY syndrome, all of those types of things, but people had the right to be involved. As the planning system has evolved, I've seen a bit of an erosion of that. The erosion of the ability for the public to be involved. A lot of that revolved around green energy. For example, it came to a height there, but it's also happening in things like plans of subdivision. I referred earlier to the whole aspect of community planning permit systems. I think those are great. They're a super tool. I'm a little worried about the restrictions on appeals and how public process is incorporated once those are in place. I think planning benefits from robust public involvement, and sure, it can be difficult, it can be controversial, it can raise some challenges, but I think it's better for all of us if we have a robust public process. And I think the wide use of minister zoning orders is not good for that process.
Okay, thank you, Michael. I think in the interest of time, we'll head to the last section of your presentation and hopefully have a couple of minutes at the end for some questions. But as Michael's indicated, if you have something that we're not getting to, appreciate, Michael, you saying that you can respond by email, but we'll do our best to answer them as well through the Q&A. So on to the last section, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you. So here we're going to go over a lot of territory that could have taken up this entire presentation, and we're going to do it very quickly. The next subject I want to talk about was aggregate resources licenses, ARA licenses. So what are they? Pits or quarries on private land. Operation on Crown land requires a permit as opposed to a license. There are different classes of licenses based upon tonnage and so on. It involves approval of a site plan along with the license, and those site plans show existing features, how the site is to be operated, how the site is to be rehabilitated. They require a whole bundle of studies for a successful license application. And you must operate the quarry in accordance with the plan, the conditions on the license, and changes will come into effect and also in the future in terms of how applications below the water table are going to be dealt with. They are not subject to municipal site plan approval, and they're subject to zoning to a limited extent. The ARA prevails over zoning. Now, the biggest effect in terms of zoning is the lands have to be zoned to permit extraction, but after that, a lot of the provisions, et cetera, don't necessarily apply because the ARA would override those. Now, what are the opportunities available for ecology to influence planning? First of all, establishment of the licensed area. You need to look at it. And sometimes it's actually beneficial to include natural heritage features within the licensed area because the site plan approval process, all the notes on the site plan and the license allow you to have some pretty strong management techniques and goals and so on that natural heritage feature when it falls under the licensed area. A lot of people think, oh, don't include it in the licensed area because then it might be subject to extraction, but in fact, including it can provide some greater control over the management of that natural heritage feature. Licenses do come with conditions, and the site plan notes and requirements are set out on the site plan, and they can be incredibly detailed. You have notes and pages of notes on site plans in terms of outlining the details of how things will be operated, how rehabilitation will occur, etc. So in establishing the notes on a site plan, you want to consider both operations and rehabilitation. So look at the ecological aspects of the operations and the sequencing of extraction, and then also look at the ecological implications of rehabilitation and how you rehabilitate the site. And we are making good advancements in terms of rehabilitation on natural in aggregates. I think the ministry could maybe assist with that even more so. I was involved on a project that was adjacent to an aggregate site, and it had this great big pond in it, and there was, I counted over 10 snapping turtles quite easily just in a few minutes. And the next year when I went back to that site, the pond was gone. It was filled in to meet rehab requirements to create a perfectly flat site. I think we need to be far more innovative in rehabilitation, and the door is opening to that more, to have a little more variation in the landscape, to respond a little bit more to what's happening on the site as you rehabilitate, as opposed to sticking to the rigidity of some of the older rehabilitation ideas. Now, operational notes can be extensive. They can require mitigation measures, they require monitoring, and so on, an adaptive management approach. Monitoring requirements can be on-site and off-site. Rehabilitation notes, it obviously deals with progressive rehabilitation as well as habitat creation and monitoring. It's an ideal opportunity for compensation, as you can tie releases of phases to monitoring of compensation performance. By this, I mean that, for example, I was involved in a site where there was going to be compensation for woodland impacts. And we were able to use the phasing of development, and because aggregate sites, particularly quarries, may occur over a long period of time, we were able to put the last phase, which would involve some woodland compensation as the last phase, and therefore set targets that had to be met in order to actually go and extract that last phase. So not only did we have securities to deal with compensation and rehabilitation, but the extraction of that last phase was dependent on meeting performance targets for the establishment of woodland cover in the compensation areas before any extraction could actually occur in that phase. Now I want to move on to non-planning act agreements, and that also includes non-ARA agreements and so on. And this is where the municipality has broad ability under the Municipal Act to enter into agreements with any party on a voluntary basis. And this can be packaged in with other types of agreements, including Planning Act agreements. it offers a huge range of flexibility there in terms of what can be dealt with, what can be negotiated. But it really depends on the cooperations of the various parties. And it's not a compelling tool, but it's a permissive tool. You can utilize this tool, but you can't compel somebody to enter into a side agreement like this. But they can be tremendously useful. And I'll give an example. We dealt with the compensation project on a quarry, and I was working for the municipality at the time, reviewing this approval. And we looked at compensation. We said, well, we also want to enter into a side agreement relative to this, where the municipality will get half a cent per ton of the material produced for tree planting and another half a cent a ton for environmental land acquisition that the municipality can use throughout its area of jurisdiction to acquire environmental lands. And then we also entered into an agreement that allowed the school board to access the applicant's experts and scientists for school tours, and they would pay the busing costs for the school tours to get out there. So very innovative agreement that was entered into as part of a larger package involving compensation and mitigation and avoidance and so on. So it's an additional tool that can be utilized where you have cooperative parties. Now, we've looked at each of the planning instruments separately, but often they are dealt with in an integrated fashion. So it's not usual that you're just looking at a zoning bylaw or just looking at a subdivision, etc. Often these come in packages that may be processed concurrently or in sequence. So in that case, you want to make sure that your ecological information that you're providing, your assessment that you're providing, looks at each of those and sets out then coordinated and comprehensive recommendations that apply to each of those approvals, but do so as well in an integrated fashion. So look at what's happening, look at what the approval process is going to be here, and find where you have the different opportunities to achieve your ecological objectives. And sometimes that may require some adjusted wording when you're dealing with the various applications through the process. So you may have a particular objective. How you achieve that objective for each one of the applications in that overall package might be slightly different. So for example, for management of a riparian area in a proposed plan of subdivision, if it's also subject to an official plan amendment, at the OPA stage, you might want to establish policy to require habitat management plan for the riparian area, and then lay out your objectives and goals and establish the acceptable uses. At the zoning stage, you want to establish the appropriate zone boundaries, permitted uses consistent with the management plan. At the draft plan subdivision stage, you might look at the block creation, consider the layout of the plan and the remedial measures needed to maintain the function of the riparian area, subject to the management plan, and then what's needed to establish clearance requirements. And then at the final approval, you want to ensure that the management plan requirements are integrated into the subdivision agreement, that securities are established and warranty guarantee periods are established. So again, look at each of the tools and the opportunities it provides, but in the context of the bigger overall management plan objectives, targets, and so on. Now, I do want to talk about another very effective tool in terms of engaging community as well as ecological practices in the planning system, and that is engagement with an Indigenous perspective. There was a great study done with Ontario Nature, Planning Canada, Trent University in terms of looking at Indigenous perspectives on conservation offsetting, for example. A really good study. 5 case studies explored the issues, opportunities, potential benefits, and challenges of biodiversity offsetting in this case from an Indigenous perspective. The potential benefits included habitat improvements, potential revenue for biodiversity initiatives, restored sites to increase opportunity for maintenance of traditional practices of hunting and gathering. Restoration provides increased opportunity for education and spiritual connectivity, builds capacity for cultural restoration, enhanced awareness and understanding amongst governments, development proponents, non-Indigenous organizations in the public, and integration of cultural protocols in negotiations and proceedings, in outreach, exhibits, media attention, and site visits. Challenges: lack of Indigenous representation in the decision-making process, lack of community experience in terms of emerging science, and little information exists about First Nations experiences and models. an unlevel playing field, capacity and resources, inflexible timelines and procedures. You really need to consider the needs of the community, the manner of decision-making, the objectives and interests of the community, and so on. The cultural barriers, no allowance for consensus building approach, which is so fundamental to the decision-making. No real allowance sometimes for empathy and spiritual connectivity provided for in our process. Often it doesn't take those aspects into consideration. The absence sometimes of working respectively across cultures. Insufficient government standards, setting the bar too low, for example, in many cases, and then having a reluctance to move forward in terms of raising that bar. Obviously, when you're working with the Indigenous community, you have the duty to consult, and you should be following appropriate practices in that regard. The additional opportunities to enrich natural heritage planning, the incorporation of traditional knowledge to inform restoration, the utilization of cross-cultural capacity of two-eyed seeing in terms of shared history, knowledge, experience valued equally, capacity building within the community, enhance community resources and therefore capacity in the community, youth engagement and participation, very, very productive and rewarding aspect. And that is a very brief presentation. We're right at about 4 minutes to go here, so I want to leave some time for questions. I really wish we could have spent more time, particularly on the last part of the presentation, but we are nearing the end here.
Thank you very much, Michael. We have a little bit of time here for questions before we wrap up. Again, I think we can stay on for a little bit. I know it's supposed to end at 11:30, but if you want to stay on, we will be spending a little bit of time on the questions past 11:30. So just a couple things to get to then. Do you have any notable examples of experience with prescribing targets for ecological natural heritage enhancement in official plan policy?
Yeah, again, I think it's similar to a previous question in terms of this is an evolving area. And I mentioned my work with the Canadian Wildlife Service in terms of the habitat guidelines and how much disturbance is too much guidelines. And that was an effort to really provide an information base to municipalities and conservation authorities to utilize to help set those targets. And I know conservation authorities did some work in that regard in terms of, for example, watershed report cards, where it was reporting on the status of the watershed, had targets, had achievements, where things were going. An official plan is the document that can set the stage for that type of work at a municipal level. So again, look at your goals, objectives, look at setting some of those targets and so on, but then you need to move it out of the official plan in terms of general community initiatives that you're doing, education, involvement, citizen science. You need to move it forward through the official plan and the decisions you're making on the various applications and so on.
Great, thank you. Have you encountered situations where the OP designation has been updated, but the zoning has not been updated to reflect the policies in the official plan? Zoning development rates can conflict with the intent of the OP. Do you have any examples of how that issue can be resolved?
Yes, that's a critical issue because unfortunately, again, municipal resources are often stretched and limited, and it's not unusual for the update of an official plan to not coincide with zoning. Now, we're doing a number of those exercises ourselves, doing official plans for municipality. And I really try to encourage municipalities to do it concurrently, because the official plan is your vision, the zoning bylaw is where it hits the ground. And when you're writing the official plan, it's really, I think, efficient as well as appropriate to write the implementing zoning bylaw at the same time, if you have that opportunity, because you can then directly link policy to what you're trying to achieve. What you're trying to achieve as the policy in your zoning. Do it at the same time if you can, or as concurrently as possible. Now, there are situations where that cannot occur. And yes, the zoning is the legal document in place, and there are issues around deemed conformity and things like that. This is where sometimes you need to fall back on, first of all, how you write your official plan. If there are certain areas where you think that that's going to be a problem, then you can specify in your official plan the requirement for a zoning amendment under certain circumstances. Now that's not going to help where a zoning bylaw already establishes a right for a certain use, but it will help when it comes to dealing with amendments to that zoning bylaw. When you're dealing with existing permissions in a zoning bylaw, that's a very difficult issue to deal with relative to the official plan, in that if they're existing permissions and it's issuance of a building permit, that process, if you've got fundamental problems there, that just means you need to update your zoning bylaw as quickly as you can. But in terms of dealing with outdated standards or outdated provisions or other things in your zoning bylaw where you can prompt a zoning amendment application by writing an official plan policy that requires that, that's one way to deal with that issue.
Thanks for that, Michael. I've experienced that where I've had individuals say that the policy is just policy. It's kind of like just guidelines, and they always fall on the zoning bylaw as being the only thing that you need to care about, and that's a difficult connection sometimes to make to the public in general. So just another question, and it really kind of gets to the public engagement aspect of things, but how can we better make the connections between OPs, secondary plans, and the development next door for the public so that we can engage them earlier in the process? It gets that issue of people aren't really aware of something until the bulldozers are on the ground, sort of thing.
And that's a very difficult issue to deal with. Struggled with that throughout my career in terms of motivating people to come out for official plans and zoning bylaws as opposed to waiting, because if they wait, it works against them as well, because often it's too late to deal with some of the fundamental decisions about land use have been made, the fundamental decisions about policies have been made. So one of the ways to deal with that is to let people know that's the case. But people lead busy lives. People are incredibly busy. You know, they've got lots of things on their mind, lots of things to do. And it attracts their attention much more so when it's something that's going to happen immediately beside them, as opposed to looking at the broad vision for the municipality for the next 20 years. But one of the tools that interestingly has come out relative to COVID, I find interesting, is that virtual engagement on an online platform is attracting much bigger audiences than we anticipated. So when we look at public input in workshops and so on, we're getting more input by using a virtual platform than we did previously. And we're also putting platforms on that don't need engagement in real time. So we're putting on forums for discussions. We're putting on information that people can go to when they have the time to go to it, instead of being fixed to 7 p.m. Tuesday morning. You got to show up for this, or evening. I did have a day after New Year's one time, 8 a.m. in the morning public meeting. That obviously wasn't scheduled for public involvement. But you know, that fixed time is not conducive to generating public input. But if you put something on the web and allow people to access it at their leisure, so to speak, you can have much more engagement. So I think that's a tool that we need to make more use of as we move forward. And COVID has kind of kicked that into high gear, obviously. But I think it's something that should stick around and we should utilize much more often, because that helps. That allows people to get motivated about these larger exercises and participate in them, but at a time period that is a little longer and not as structured as our previous approaches.
Just a couple more questions, I think. Do you have any notable examples, experience, and prescribing targets for ecological natural heritage enhancement in official plan policy?
Yeah, that again, that's where you want to look at those documents that I talked about. Watershed report cards will help provide you some information to how much habitat is enough guidelines. If you've got a GIS system in your municipality, you can look at your natural heritage system in your municipality, look for weaknesses, look for gaps, and develop goals and objectives to fill those gaps. And again, establish those targets in policy approaches within the official plan, and then move that through the system.
Okay. And I think I'm just going to go with this one last question here. Apologize for not getting to all of them, but there's a number in the queue, and we'll try to answer them after the fact for you, I believe. So just the last question, you discussed many useful planning tools to implement recommendations, but many of those tools are dependent on a willing municipality and proponent to enter into an agreement or undertake a rezoning. This is often seen as onerous for a 1 or 2 lot severance. What approach can be taken when these appropriate tools are not supported?
Right. So unfortunately, it's not a quick answer in many of these cases. You have to lay the foundation. You have to work with your community. You have to work with your council. You have to educate people. You have to develop that rapport with the community, with your council to support those things. Again, that's where you can bring people on side by working with the public, engaging with the public, using communications tools. For example, I talked about the Eco Park. Another thing we did was establish a citizen science project where people could, through our naturalists, talk about natural heritage observations in the municipality, generate that interest in the community and so on. You build that up, that gets your support in the community, that gets your support in council. Dealing with development applications, I often think the best way to do it is, again, get away from the rules-based approach, go to the objectives-based approach. And the objectives-based approach isn't just for the municipality or for the agency, it's also considering the objectives of the proponent. So what do they want to achieve? What are their goals and objectives? Look at your goals and objectives and see how you can bring those together and arrive then at a decision where everybody wins. If everybody wins, people are a little more interested in being innovative and maybe adding something they hadn't thought about, if they can see that it's in their better interest to do that, if they somehow helps them achieve their objective. So look for those where you can. There are many other ways as well, but that's just a quick answer on that one as well.
Okay, well, I think with that, I'm going to bring a close to the questions. We've kind of come to the end of our time. I'd want to take this opportunity to thank you, Michael, for an engaging and informative overview of the planning and ecology section. As you outlined, it's you know, a lot of information went over, kind of skimmed the surface, but I think it got a lot of good thoughts going on, a lot of good questions, and really appreciate your time and effort in pulling this together. So this Latornell Leadership Project session has been brought to you by the Latornell Conference Steering Committee. I would like to thank all those who helped make this happen, including Janet Ivey, Chair of the Latornell Conference, Jamie Jodry, the Conference Program Chair, Nakisha Mohammed, and Jane Lewington of Conservation Ontario, Mario Mallet, and Karen Anderson of Allset Inc., who are the Latornell Conference organizers, as well as help from Barb McKenzie-Winia, Eric Gilbert, and Sarah Hodgkiss. We would all like to be at Latornell. We were just thinking at the start of this that right now we would be at Latornell enjoying the camaraderie and the information that's provided. Unfortunately, as it's been noted, that's been canceled this year, initially because of the uncertainty associated with the review of our act, but also COVID has obviously paid an impact. So as we reimagine the future of our conference, we hope you enjoyed this opportunity to keep in touch. We have a few more sessions coming up later this fall and in the new year. Please keep a watch for our next webinar, Tuesday, December 8th, Communicating Through a Pandemic. Registration will be opening soon. One more thing for you to do before you leave. Please complete our last polls on the screen telling us how informative you felt this webinar was. A reminder that this webinar has been recorded. There's been a lot of questions about that in the Q&A, and it will be posted on the Latornell Symposium website for everyone to watch. Give us a couple of days to get that up and posted. And again, I note that Michael has offered to be contacted if he has any questions, if you have any questions that you want to follow up with Michael on. So with that, thank you again for the time today to learn more about connecting planning ecology. Stay safe, everyone. Bye for now and enjoy your weekend.